Welcome back to the Lead to Win podcast, the podcast where we explore strategies, mindsets, and stories behind successful leadership and personal development. I'm your host, Bo Bergen. Let's do it. What a treat we have today. I feel like I've known this guy for years for some reason. Maybe I'm just doing really good research, but excited to welcome Joe Schmit to the show today. Joe is an author, award-winning broadcaster, community leader, and popular keynote speaker. His book, Silent Impact: Influence Through Purpose, Persistence, and Passion, is now in its second edition. His new book is titled Impact Blueprint: A Step-by-Step Journey to a Life of Significance. Joe was recently honored by the National Speakers Association with the Certified Speaking Professional designation. Less than 15% of NSA members worldwide have achieved the CSP designation. As a sports broadcaster, he has covered every major sporting event in the past 4 decades and has interviewed many of the biggest names in sports. He joined KSTP-TV in 1985 and has won 18 Emmys from the National Television Academy. He was also honored with a National Headliner Award in 2001. Joe, a warm welcome to you, and thanks for coming on today.
Oh, thank you, Bo. I appreciate that, and sorry for the long intro. I should have sent you the mini version.
That's all right. The more my listeners can know about you, the better. So, first question, what kind of inspired you to get into the world of broadcasting and sports in general?
Well, I was like a lot of kids. I was a sports nut growing up. I played a lot of sports, and I led the league in average. Despite how hard I tried, I was always going to be an average athlete. And at one point, somebody said, "You know something, Schmidt, with your big mouth and your love of sports, you ought to become a sportscaster." And it stuck. It had that impact at that point. I thought, man, I could make my living going to sporting events, covering games, interviewing athletes, and telling stories, and that's exactly what I have done for 4 decades.
So speaking of stories, I want to get right into it. What's one of your favorite stories that you've been able to tell over the course of your career?
Well, I've been pretty lucky. It's interesting that I've interviewed some of the biggest names. I've had one-on-one interviews with Muhammad Ali and Tiger Woods and Jack Nicklaus and Wayne Gretzky and Michael Jordan, on and on and on. And those kind of really aren't the ones that stick out. The stories that stick out are the ones, the win one for a Gipper story. The kid with, dreams in his eyes, and all of a sudden you see those dreams come true. I know we're going to talk a little bit later about Joe Mauer. I covered Joe Mauer in high school, and just a couple of weeks ago, he went into the Pro Baseball Hall of Fame. I tell a story when I do my keynotes about doing a TV show at the football field where the Minnesota Vikings held training camp, the University of Minnesota Mankato. And right before we went on the air one night, a high school kid who's working that summer as a ball boy decides to come and work out and run up and down those stairs. Well, and I thought I knew exactly what that kid did. He called his buddies and he said, "Hey, watch Channel 5 tonight because there'll be a shot of me in the background running up and down those stairs." And sure enough, that was the case. Well, the next night, I went back by that football field about the same time we did the show. There were no lights on. There were no TV cameras and no head coaches of a football team around. And there's that kid running and working just as hard as he had the night before. I had it all wrong. Well, that kid back then was a high school kid. His name is Larry Fitzgerald Jr., who went on to become one of the best wide receivers in National Football League history. So when I can talk about preparation, and good enough isn't good enough if you want to be the best. And what are you doing to raise your game to the next level? What are you doing to have continuous improvement in your career, in your life? And so those real world examples like that are very fun to share.
Mm-hmm. So when you think of the Minnesota sports scene in particular, you mentioned him before, but many names come to mind. The Kirby Pucketts, the whoever you want to say, but one person in particular that I've always admired is Joe Mauer, and you've been connected with him over the years, and sure you get asked about him all the time, but I want to know, in general, what made him so special as both a person and an athlete?
Well, he is a Hall of Fame athlete, and he's a Hall of Fame person. And it goes back to his parents and the values that they instilled in him and the work ethic that they instilled in him. Joe was a very special athlete from a young age. Joe had two older brothers, and he was all of a sudden playing every sport with the older kids, and he was better than all the other kids. When he was 7, 8 years old, he's playing with 10, 11, 12-year-olds. That's a pretty big jump in age, but he was better than everybody because he was a special athlete. But Joe was able to remain humble through the entire experience. And as a matter of fact, Joe and I just together wrote a children's book. And it's based on one of the stories I tell in my keynote. It's based on one of the stories in my book, Silent Impact. And that children's book, 100% of the proceeds are going to charity, and it's been an amazing hit. It was #1 on Amazon for a couple of days. The distributor couldn't handle all the orders and had to take it down, which I'm still trying to figure out what made sense there, but that's another story. But anyway, so depending on how far you want me to go into Joe Mauer the man and how he became Joe Mauer the great player, I'd be happy to share that, Bo.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched interviews over the years with him, and I think I watched one recently with you where he was still, I think he was waiting to hear if he was going to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. And, he talked about just the family aspect and what he's been doing here after baseball, but, I don't know how close you are to him, but just kind of talk about the kind of dad he is and kind of what made him who he is as a person.
Well, I will tell you the story which the children's book is based off of, because that really sums up Joe, his character, and the kind of person he is in one fell swoop. 22 years ago, Joe was a senior at Cretin-Derham Hall High School in St. Paul. Now, as I mentioned, Joe was a special athlete. Joe was recruited by every major college football program to be their starting quarterback. He had signed a deal to play at Florida State for the legendary Bobby Bowden. But Joe was also an all-state guard in basketball, and he was also an amazing baseball player. And with the very first pick in the amateur baseball draft, the Minnesota Twins had that pick, and they took Joe Mauer out of Cretin-Derham Hall High School. So you got to imagine when Joe was in high school, he was a pretty big deal. As a matter of fact, when Joe was playing baseball in these sports, other people were coming up to him. Opposing teams wanted his autograph. That's how great of an athlete he was. Well, every day after Joe's 4th-hour class, Joe noticed that a young student who was blind went to the lunchroom and ate by himself. And Joe invited him to sit at his table because he didn't think it was right. And the next thing he knew, Mike, the guy's name is Mike Halley, and Mike would come and sit at the table. They all became great friends. Mike was a big sports fan. They didn't even know that because nobody knew Mike because he was different and he was blind and he sat alone. Well, Joe opened the door for that. Well, what I did is I put my reporter's cap on and I found 6 guys who sat around that table every day 22 years ago with Joe and Mike Hawley. And then the story started to come in, and the impact that it had to this day on all those individuals is pretty remarkable. So I tell that story in my keynotes, and I actually got Joe and Mike back together in the same high school in the same lunchroom and had a reunion. And it's a very powerful story that we talk about. And that's when we decided to write a children's book. And Joe only agreed to do the children's book when we came up with the idea that 100% of the proceeds would go to charity, and that we would also allow people to donate so we could then donate books to schools and to kids. And next week, we are donating books to 500 elementary schools, and that's just the start of it. So this thing has just gone crazy with how popular it is. But when I asked Joe, I said, Joe, why did you do this? 22 years ago, you're the big man on campus. You could have big-timed anybody. Why did you do this? His answer was pretty simple. He said, because it was the right thing to do. So when we named the book, we called it The Right Thing to Do. And the book, it's geared for first, second, third graders, but I've even heard fourth, fifth, sixth graders are using it too, because it talks about the values of kindness and compassion and inclusivity. And I've now had teachers who write me emails and social media posts that say, this opened up the conversation in our classroom where we can talk about those subjects that maybe we don't talk about a lot. And so it's been very, very rewarding. and the goals of the book are being met. We're raising money for two great charities, and we are getting books in people's hands who might not get books. And then on top of it, we are sparking conversations that we need to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a testament to, I knew he was a good guy, but you don't hear all those behind the scenes things, and glad you shared that. So, of
Thank you.
course, we need to talk a little leadership today,
Yep.
which that's what this podcast is about. But I want to know, how did you get into speaking to people about leadership? I've listened to a couple of your talks, and they're very good, and I just want to know kind of what inspired you to get into that scene.
Well, I would get asked all the time because I'm on TV. I've been the main sports anchor of the ABC affiliate Minneapolis St. Paul since 1985. So, I'm a year older than dirt. And but so I get asked all the time to speak to athletic banquets and Optimist clubs and different charity events. And I used to go and tell the inside the Gipper story. What was it like to cover Kirby Puckett in the 87 and 91 World Series? And what was it like to be in a champagne shower? All those kinds of things. And at some point I thought, you know what? I'm standing up here patting myself in the back for being at all these great events where I was just doing my job. So finally I decided to put a little work into my speech, and I decided to tell people stories about people who made an impact. And they might have been athletes who had an impact, but it wasn't because of what they did on the field, it's what they did off the field. And in the process, I started studying leaders and what made a good leader, what made a bad leader, what made a good team, how was the culture on this team better, and why was it better? And what did the coaches and the people do around it to make sure that it happened? That's how I was able to transform from being a speaker talking about being in the locker room to talking about what it was like to make an impact and how we can all be more aware and intentional of the impact we have. And it's worked out. It's worked out really kind of amazing. I've been able to use my reporting skills and my public speaking skills to my advantage, and it's helped me connect to a lot of different people and open people's eyes on how they can break new ground and maybe approach leadership in a different way.
Yeah, and part of being a sports broadcaster, I would assume, is really trying to engage people, and by writing stories that are obviously engaging, they get their attention. But I want to talk a little bit about employee engagement, but also just like people that you lead in general, how to get them engaged. So, like, in general, what does employee engagement look like in the workplace?
Well, I break it down into three areas. I have a keynote I call Culture First Mindset, where I literally try to preach that culture is more important than profits. And people will look at me cross-eyed and say, you're absolutely crazy. And I said, no, when you have a culture first mindset, trying to build the culture of the team, you have a much better chance to make profits. The profits will be the byproduct because you'll have people who want to be there, people who want to be productive, and people who feel valued. So I break this presentation down into three areas: compassion, connections, and clarity. In today's world, it's not like the old days. In today's world, leaders need to show compassion. They need to care about their employees, not only what they're doing at work and how they're succeeding or not succeeding at work, but how they're doing away from work. You have to get to know your people. Number two is connections. What are you doing to connect to your people? And what are you doing to have people connect with each other? I have all the stats that back it up from McKinsey and LinkedIn and ADP. 60% of the people are more likely to stay on a job if they feel connected to the people that they're working for. 60%, I do a 60-60-60 thing. 60% of the people are more likely to be more productive and work harder if they feel that they've been praised for what they have done in the past week. People patting them on the back. Nobody ever quit a job because they said, every time I turn around, they're patting me on the back. I'm done. And then the last area is clarity. People need to be crystal clear on what their role is and why that role is important to the organization. And if the role is to try to make money for the company, there's not going to be the loyalty. There's not going to be the trust. You're not going to get a highly productive team that way. It has to be something bigger than that today. People want to work for the greater good. What is the company doing to really help society? What are they doing to help the communities they serve? What are they doing to help the people that they serve, right there at work? And that's why I tell people, you have a strategic plan, you have a financial plan, you have a crisis management plan, but do you have a culture plan? And if you don't plan for your culture and realize it's a living, breathing organism within your organization, you might succeed, but you just made it a lot more difficult. And that's why the culture of the organization is so important. That's how you lead the day. If you lead first with culture and you put those three components in there, compassion, connection, and clarity, you just have a much better chance of succeeding. You have a much better chance of recruiting and retaining your best talent. Right now, that's a problem. 90% of the businesses in the world have recruiting and retaining talent. And every time you lose an employee, it costs 50 to 75% of their salary to replace them. And then at the same time, you might replace that person with somebody who's not as good as the person you replaced. So how much is it costing you in the end? And if you lose 5 good employees a year in 5 years, it's going to really impact that bottom line. We actually have a guy who came in and did valuations of companies compared to, what it costs to recruit and retain employees. I mean, it could be millions of dollars in a decade.
Yeah. Speaking of the retention and recruitment piece, I come from the world of education, and that's something that has really been talked about a lot lately. Is teachers are leaving in record numbers, and there's a record low of people getting into the profession. So obviously, school districts around the country are looking at ways to figure out how to keep people and also get new people in. What you can't just, I know a popular thing is, well, we need to raise wages or raise salaries, and that'll help keep them around. But I think people put too much into salaries, and like you said, they want to work for the greater good. And so, what other ways could, I'm thinking just in education, but really in general, what other ways do you see people? What measures are they putting in place to keep people around and get new people?
Well, it's a really good question, and I have 2 daughters who are teachers, and I worry about one of them in particular who could be one of these victims, just because
Mm-hmm.
she's just not getting the support. And let's face it, parents are different today. We used to have helicopter parents who would kind of hover over, to make sure everything was okay. Well, now you have snowplow parents who don't let their kids fail. And they don't
Mm-hmm.
realize that if their kids fail, they can learn from that failure and learn how to build resistance or resilience and some of the things that they're going to need later in life. So, I know that it's not money, because the research shows that if you want to hold on to your employees, you got to pay them 20 to 25% more. You were in education, school districts don't have it. There's a
Right.
lot of businesses that don't have that 25% slack there. That's just very hard to find. So you have to figure out ways to build culture. And the old days of putting a foosball table in the break room and calling that culture are over. I say there's a gap. There's a gap. Most companies have a gap. Even companies with great cultures have a gap. That's the culture you have today to the culture you really want to strive for. And what are you doing to fill that gap? And part of it is just making the effort. And part of it is just letting people know you care. Um, I know that at my daughter's school, they doubled down on mental health days for teachers.
Mm-hmm.
They know the pressure and stress that they're under. So the old days of the boss worrying about how many hours you put in or how many days you took off, they're kind of over, because you got to make sure people can come into that job. And there's a lot of stressful jobs out there, ready, refreshed, ready to go. But all the numbers say it starts with the leader really caring about the employee, or the leader caring about the team that they deal with. I have I do a thing when I work with clients, and we do surveys at the beginning, and then 6 months later, after we start a program, we ask questions like this. And I think these questions really tell you about where the world is going to. Have you received positive feedback in the last 10 days? in the old days, that would never happen. Now that's important. My manager cares about me. Do you have a good friend at work? Huge numbers. If you have a good friend at work, they're much. Here's the one I like, one of the ones I like the most. Would you recommend a friend apply for a job at your organization? I worked with one company and the number was low. I said, here's our problem right here. You're telling me that people would not, your people are working for you, don't want anybody else to come to work here because they think it's such a negative place to work. What are we going to do about it? And we always dig until we find out. There's always blind spots. Every organization will have a blind spot where they kind of don't know what it is. And it could be, it could be a couple of bad managers. It could be as simple as work-life balance, and or it could be, there's always a myriad of things that sometimes people aren't getting enough support that they can grow into the job. When I get into clarity, questions I ask, are you proud to say you work here? Is your opinion valued and requested? That one is traditionally low on a lot of companies. So a lot of companies talk about having an open door policy, but do they really do it? And what are they doing about it? So I think that the first thing that has to happen is you got to really connect with your people, but then you also have to find out where are our blind spots, because they're out there. And, there are employees that just aren't going to work and aren't going to work hard. We know that. But we did research. We asked people 2 questions. We asked them if they were a going away party, who would the most people show up for? And we found out that person wasn't always the person who sat in the corner office. Sometimes it was the person who cleaned the corner office. But that person has a lot to say of what's going on in the culture of that group or organization. Then we asked the opposite question. Who would the least amount of people show up for? What traits did that person have? Well, they weren't very productive. They weren't very good team players. They didn't seem to care. Well, then we dug down a little deeper and tried to ask why. What was the issue? And many times when we peeled back that onion, we found out the reason that person was not thriving was because the job was too big for them. They were not getting enough support. You as a leader have to be aware of that and see if you can get that person some help to lift them up. If you lift them up, you might find out you could save that employee. Now, some employees you can't save. We all know that. But many times, if you think about it, are you ever happy at doing something you're not good at? Are you ever happy doing something you're really not clear while you're doing it? So that I think you put it all together, and it's always going to be a work in progress. But I think that organizations that really focus on this and make people realize they really care about them are the ones that win.
Yeah. I've talked with a few of my guests about, just finding your why. And that's a cliche statement, but it's true. Purpose and why, oftentimes leads to a very healthy culture when everybody's got the same mindset about that. And as leaders, it's hard to figure out the ways to remind people on a day-to-day basis, like, hey, why are you doing this in the first place? In education, it's widespread. Like, we have really tried to put in, I would almost call it an initiative, of people finding out what their why is and holding to that. But what I've noticed is, and I tell my coaches this, I'm an athletic director by day, but I tell my coaches this all the time, like, your purpose is much more important than the objectives you have. And I always tell them purpose over objective. And I think that kind of, at least for me in my mind, it kind of makes everything clearer, and gives me a little bit of motivation when I think back to it. So I think purpose is very vital in how happy you are at your workplace, for sure.
Well, you know something, Bo? Then the byproduct becomes success.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
byproduct. I talk about a track coach at the University of Minnesota, Roy Griak, and Roy was a very successful coached Big Ten champs, national champs, Olympians. A very, very solid, great guy. Roy stayed as a volunteer with the program into his 90s, and when Roy passed, I was reading all these tributes to Roy on his Caringbridge site. And I recognized the names because they were the national champs, Olympians, and so forth. And not one of them said, I made it to the Olympics because of you. I remember that Big Ten championship we won. They all said things like, I'm a better dad today because you were in my life. I'm a better man today because I went to the University of Minnesota. And that's where I actually, when I wrote my second book, The Impact Blueprint, a step-by-step journey to a life of significance, I started thinking, Roy Griak lived a life of significance. Not because of the trophies he had, the trophy case, and not because of the champions he coached. It was because of the impact he had. And guess what? His purpose. And guess what? The byproduct was? Trophies in the trophy case, coaching champions. But what he did was he made everybody a better person. He made the culture a place where people could grow, would feel safe, wanted to help each other out. And guess what? Then that byproduct became all those other great things.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so good. So good about purpose. I'm a huge purpose guy. I love talking culture, and especially in athletics. I mean, that's kind of my job, and sometimes I don't feel like I have enough time to focus on that stuff, but I've quickly figured out you need to make time. Those tasks, those meaningless tasks can wait. And if you focus on culture, like you said, the byproduct is success at the end of the day.
I just add one quick thing to that. I always tell people to schedule themselves some impact time, because if you let your schedule get scheduled, you're not going to go around and check on people. But whether it's 15 minutes a day or 15 minutes twice a week, where you just go around and you just find out what people are doing, find out what they're struggling with, find out what they're happy about, find out how their kid did in the softball tournament this past weekend. If you don't schedule it, it doesn't get done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, what role does allowing an employee to be innovative and really just more in general have a voice and feel heard, but what role does that play in their overall engagement at their job?
Well, that's huge, and that's usually a tough spot for a lot of companies, because there are layers of management where the decisions might be made at a different level than the person who has the great idea. But that has to be a trust issue. There has to be enough trust within the organization, within the leadership, that an employee can go and say, have we ever thought about doing it this way? Or I had a great idea, and they feel safe and comfortable doing it. And even if it's an idea that doesn't work or won't work, make them feel good and pat them on the back and let them know, thank you for coming. So they feel that safety. We did research on, what made a good boss and what made a bad boss. And on the good boss issue, it was the one thing that surprised me on that research was a good boss is tough but fair. And we dug a little deeper on it, and we found out why. If a boss is tough on you, they believe in you. Not all of them, but they see something in you that you don't see in yourself. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get it out of you. And many times they help you raise your game to the next level because they're pushing you to that next level. So and when you have that boss, it equals that trust that you need. Because if you don't trust your boss, or you don't trust what the company's doing or upper management, are you going to go the extra mile? Are you going to deliver wow customer service? Are you going to stay late on Friday when the project, needs to be done? Probably not. Probably not. But if you trust them that they care about you and they're going to take care of you, that's when all of a sudden those little extras happen.
So shifting gears just a little bit here, something that I haven't discussed on my podcast thus far, and I figured you might have a little bit of insight on it, self-awareness. And I wanted to get your thoughts on self-awareness as a leader. And I understand self-awareness to really knowing yourself. It's to be quite honest, you just know yourself. You know your strengths, your weaknesses. How would you define self-awareness?
Well, there definitely are two things. It's being aware and then being intentional about it, and knowing exactly what you said, what your strengths and what your weaknesses are. And I think, quite frankly, it's doing a personal inventory of yourself. One of the exercises I like to do when we start talking about culture and leadership and how I can make a bigger impact, not only in your professional life, but your personal life, is I have a sheet made up I call the triple play. And what are you going to stop? What are you going to start? What are you going to continue from this day forward? And then underneath, I have 3 bullet points. What are the results going to be of stop, starting, and continue? So I'll give you mine for an example. Because I'm a leader, I've got a staff of 6 in my sports office. I also, on several boards and so forth. So I'm very familiar with leading teams. And my stop was sarcasm. I can be a sarcastic guy for a joke. Well, all of a sudden I realized, so my 3 bullets under there, I'm stopping sarcasm. My 3 bullets under there is, in sarcasm, there's truth, so it could hurt somebody. In sarcasm, people aren't going to know whether you're serious or not being serious. Sarcasm can cause confusion. For a guy who talks about clarity, not a good straight. What am I going to start? I am going to start scheduling impact time. So, as I talked about before, so I can go find out what's going on in people's life. That's going to build trust. That's going to build the loyalty and the teamwork that we want. What am I going to continue? I had a boss early on who was a lavish praise boss. And I figured very early on, it made me feel good. So I leap lavish praise. And the mistake that most leaders make today is they wait till the project is over before they pat somebody on the back. Reward progress. Positive reinforcement today is the essence of great leadership. And, just even take a look at the coaches today who are successful. The yellers and the screamers and the hollowers, those are going by the wayside. It's the ones who build you up rather than tear you down. So by doing that, you're going to get the loyalty you want. You're going to get people who will work the extra mile, all these things. So that's that personal inventory that I think you have to take of yourself. And there are other exercises you can do, but it does start with you. I tell the story about, a difference awareness can make. There was a nurse at a children's hospital during the pandemic who, as soon as all the staff had to start wearing masks and shields, and it looked like they were in hazmat suits, all of a sudden the kids they were taking care of were afraid of all the staff, where before they were fine with them. Well, one of the nurses on her own decided to get everybody's picture with a big smiling face on it. And over the weekend, she made new name tags for the 4th floor where she had worked in this hospital. And everybody wore the name tags on Monday when she came back. And all of a sudden, the kids were relieved because they would point to the name tag and point to their face. All of a sudden, they realized that was the smiling face underneath that mask and underneath that shield. By Friday, the entire hospital had new name tags because they realized how effective it was. Now, that's an awareness that made an impact. Now, sometimes you just have to take a step back to be aware. And we all get so doggone busy sometimes that that we forget where our keys are. We forget to pick up groceries. We forget to pick up our kid. Things happen. But sometimes we got to take a step back so we can be more aware, which allows us to be more intentional.
Yeah, it's good stuff. So, speaking of that reflection, good leaders always self-reflect, whether that's after a decision they've made or, a point they had to get across and how they delivered it. It's always good to self-reflect. Why is it so important for leaders to kind of reanalyze those daily interactions, and how do they learn from those?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because once again, we can all get a little bit too busy. But I think that we all have to admit we're human and we all make mistakes. And sometimes under stress, we respond emotionally instead of intellectually. So, what I tell people is, if they're dealing with a crisis, rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. I think John Maxwell was the one I heard this from, so I'm borrowing it from him. And so if it's a 7, make sure you don't react at an 8, 9, or 10. It's not a 10 alarm fire, so don't react at a 10. So learn how you react. But I think you grow from your mistakes. What I do now when I get to interview some of these athletes and coaches and have some time with them, I will ask them questions on leadership. For example, Bud Grant, the legendary football coach, passed away a couple of years ago here, and I knew Bud pretty well and covered him. And when he came back to the Vikings after he retired, and and then he lived in Minnesota. I said to Bud, I said, Bud, you went to 4 Super Bowls. You're in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. You're the winningest coach in Vikings history. What was your key to leadership? And it was very interesting because Bud was kind of an amateur psychologist. He said, well, I got to know my players and what made them tick. And I said, well, please explain. He goes, I know if I had to yell at Fran Tarkington, I couldn't yell at him in front of the team or discipline him in front of the team. I had to go behind closed doors because he was the leader and Fran's ego was such that he would respond that way better. He goes, when I had to talk to Chuck Foreman or Carl Eller, I yelled at them in front of the team because I know that'd make them mad and that'd motivate them. So he said, I really learned what made people tick. And it really got me to thinking because one size does not fit all when you're a leader. You have to figure out what motivates that person. When you said the why, their purpose, everybody's going to have a little different one. So it's your job as a leader to take that next step to maybe find out what really motivates them. You might find out they're working these hours so they can spend time with a sick parent. They're working the night shift so they can spend the day with their sick parent so they don't have to hire a nurse. Whatever the case is, sometimes you're going to find out something and that helps you show that person compassion, and you can figure out ways you can help them and support them. So it's kind of circling back to that, but I do believe the best leaders do reflect back. The best leaders are listeners, and they listen to what other people are saying. Sometimes you're making a mistake, and people are telling you you're making a mistake, but you're not listening.
Yeah. In my opinion, the more self-aware you are, the more authentic you will be. Authenticity is something that if you don't have it, nobody's going to buy into what you're saying. If you're in a leadership role and you're not authentic, good luck.
Yep.
Authentic leadership is something that seems like I don't know if it's dying, but it's definitely being harder to come by, especially in the world of like politics or, everybody's thinking that these politicians are having another agenda. They're not authentic. What do you believe are some benefits that are reaped from authentic leadership?
Well, I'll relate it to a somewhat of a personal story. When I was telling you a little bit before about my speaking career, I went and I spoke. My uncle is a preacher, and he had me come to his city, and I spoke to the high school at the athletic banquet. And this was just kind of when I was making the transition. I was still telling some Win One for the Gipper stories and starting to tell some impact stories. And anyway, afterwards, we're riding back. I was staying at his house. We're riding back home, and he said, "Joe, it was a really good speech. You had some good stories, some funny lines, and it was great. But can I give you a little advice from a guy who's been on the pulpit for 40 years and has done many, many lessons?" And I said, "Absolutely." He said, "The next speech, show them your heart." And I thought about it a second. He said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "I didn't get to know you. I felt you were doing a performance. It didn't feel authentic." So you know what my pep talk is before I step on the stage to this day, every day? I say to myself, show them your heart. And that's my way of trying to be authentic. And I think that the other thing that many leaders do is they forget that sometimes by showing vulnerability, you're showing authenticity. And the boss that has all the answers is not being very authentic. But a boss who says, I'm kind of struggling with this one. You guys, can you help me out? Or I really screwed up on this one, guys, help me out. Or I wish I would have done this one differently. It's a little bit like telling jokes. If you tell self-deprecating jokes, people are going to like you a lot more than if you're ripping somebody in the audience. So right. It's kind of that same thing. But I always kind of look for those little personal pep talks to use to get you through those tough days. So mine before I speak is show them your heart. And I remember that every time I go out there. Some days you're tired, some days it's maybe not the ideal audience, or you're just, things aren't clicking. But when I remember that, it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a certain level of fear that a lot of people have, especially leaders, when you have to admit that you don't know everything. Maybe you made a bad decision and you got to own it. And there's a certain level of fear there. But I think the people that you come in contact with every day, if you, like you said, show them your heart and you're in it for the right reasons, they'll know that. And there's that provides a little bit of a buffer between them and your bad decision or your terrible interaction, that kind of thing. Last question here before I close.
Yep.
At the end of the day, what can I do as a leader if I feel like I need to increase my self-awareness in my situation?
I would say be intentional and make one more positive impact every day. And then when you go home, write them down. Just, put it, not that you're going to brag about them, but just make one more positive. You're going to make a lot of impacts throughout the day, but then all of a sudden you say, okay, this one I'm going to be intentional. I'm going to go over to, that person over there who is struggling and put my arm around them and see what I can do to help them take care of that project. Or I'm going to go find out this person's name. I don't know who this security guard is. They started 6 months ago, and he told me his name once, and I'm embarrassed I forgot his name. I'm going to go find out who it is. So make one more positive impact a day and then write it down. Now, this does two things. It's like your 401k. Imagine the relationship equity you have built up in a year if you make one extra impact a day. It's going to grow and grow exponentially like your 401k. It's going to be compound interest. Number two, we all have those days where we feel we failed. And we all have days we made mistakes. And you had a bad day at the office. Then you can go back and open that notepad and read a couple of those special impacts that you made and say, you know what, I'm not such a bad guy. Because believe it or not, I've interviewed Olympians and Super Bowl champs and world champs and Hall of Famers. And everybody at some point struggles with self-esteem. Everybody at some point says, I'm a fraud. I shouldn't be doing this or whatever. And instead of kicking yourself, figure out ways to pick yourself up. And I go back and look at that notebook and say, I'm not such a bad guy after all. And, and maybe you're not the kind of person that takes notes. Maybe it's by your memory, but figure out what what you can do to make sure you stay in that realm. But I do tell you, I think it starts with that intentionality on one more impact a day. It'll change your life.
Mm-hmm. So in closing, maybe I'm a leader, I'm listening to this and I'm saying to myself, I want to get better. I want to grow, but I'm just having a tough time right now, whether I'm stressed, overwhelmed or just in a rut. We all have been there.
Yep.
Do you have any words of encouragement or advice for that kind of person?
One small step at a time. Keep grinding. I call it points on the board. Put points on the board every day. And, and some days you're going to score 20 and some days you're going to score 1. But figure out, even when you're at your worst, how you can just put a point on the board. And yes, we all do struggle and we all do, wonder if it's worth it, what have you. But the interesting thing is, I'll go back to Joe Mauer. Joe Mauer, I asked him, I said, how do you think your life's going to change now that you're in the Hall of Fame? And Joe had a pretty profound answer. He goes, well, my life didn't change because I went into the Hall of Fame. He goes, what I did to get into the Hall of Fame changed my life. The work I put in, the grinding that you do every day that people don't see, the behind the scenes work that you do to make sure you're the best and you're raising your game to the next level. The ability to get over injuries and self-doubt and all the things that we have as human beings, he had as a pro athlete. And so I think you look at it more of a journey and realizing that you're not going to win every day, but if you put points on the board every day, the next thing you know, you're going to be in a much better place in a month. I did it for myself physically. I recently lost about 30 pounds and joined a group of working out guys. And I went with the points on the board philosophy. There were days I didn't feel like working out. There were days I didn't feel like eating right or whatever, but I would try to put points on the board every day. And then my mantra, I'm a big believer in these mantras, come up with your own personal pep talk. my mantra during that process I'd ask myself, is this what a healthy person would do? So you could maybe ask yourself, is this what a good leader would do? And just all of a sudden, it'll help you make the right decision. It'll help you not eat that extra piece of pizza, or it'll help you take time to go, and meet somebody who's struggling, or do that extra customer service to somebody you don't think will ever buy from you again, but you never know. So ask yourself, is this what a great leader would do? Or come up with your own personal mantra that will work.
Yeah, that's good advice. Good advice. Last question. When this is all said and done, and this has kind of turned into my signature question, if you will, what do you want your legacy to be, and what do you want people to remember you by?
That's a good question. I don't think I've been asked that yet, but I'm getting older. I'll start getting asked it more. I guess, first of all, I want to be a good parent and husband and grandparent, those kinds of things, which is kind of natural. But I would like to say that at the end, they said I was a net giver. You have a lot of people who take, you got a lot of people who give. I want to be a net giver. And if I can end up on the positive side of that, then I know I did all right. There's a question that I wrote it down. I forgot. As a matter of fact, I might even have it. Sometimes I keep my little notes to myself. His name was Alaj DeVoe. Question he asked: if I had one day left on this earth, would I take or would I give? And I hope like heck I would give.
Yep. That's very good. Very good. That got me emotional. Well, Joe, that'll wrap it up today. And man, I had a good time talking with you today and hearing your insights. And I hope my listeners can take bits and pieces of this and apply some of it to their situations. And hopefully they can get better from it like I did today. And I look forward to following you from here on out, and good luck to you.
Well, thank you, Bo. And thank you for what you do working with kids. It's never been more important that kids know we have adults out there who care for us and are good examples. And I know as an athletic director, you're touching a lot of them every day.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Lead to Win podcast. If you're listening this week, make sure to drop a rating on whatever app you're listening on. I'd love to hear from listeners and make this podcast even more relevant to you. Also, make sure to follow the Lead to Win podcast on social media. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Give us a follow and feel free to share the content. Again, thanks for listening this week. I'm your host, Bo Bergen. See you next Tuesday.